Kusi, can we ask him to stop sharing, please?
I have. Kwame, can you please stop sharing your screen? We are starting the webinar now.
Ok, d'accord.
Please, there is stop sharing on your screen.
Ce bouton se trouve où là? Je vois partager l'écran, mais je ne vois pas de bouton partager. Stop.
Okay.
Hey, Kusi, I have stopped it from my side.
Okay, thank you, Sami.
Okay, you can start. It's live.
Ok, d'accord, c'est bon. C'est bon, ok.
Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone, depending on where you are joining us today. I have a very small role during this session, and Louise will do the official welcome, but I just wanted to first to quickly address some housekeeping rules, as well as some provide pointers on how to remain engaged and through navigating some of the icons that you see on your screen. Once again, welcome to the GCE-EOL webinar on the perspectives on the UNESCO's GEM report on non-state that could join us today. So one of the things that you probably see on your screen right now, it's the screen that I've shared from my end, which will be kind of like really an indication of how you, which icons on your screen you can make the choice of when it comes to selecting the language in which you would like to hear the presentations on. So we have arranged the session to be delivered in 5 language options. It will be interpreted to Arabic, French, Portuguese, and Spanish. Most of our speakers will be presenting in English. So you've got an option to make a selection from your screen from that round interpretation icon to choose to select the language of your choice. Secondly, you can activate transcribe. You can activate from the icon on your screen to transcribe the audio that you are hearing so that you can also read it from your screens. And then thirdly, there is a Q&A chat box two chat boxes that you will see with Q&A, which are actually we are going to use throughout the session to take any questions from you that you would like to direct to any of the speakers. And then if you would like to verbally communicate your questions or your comments on the presentations, please make sure that you click on the raise hand icon on your screen. That way you will be handed over a mic. We will enable you to actually take part as a speaker, and you can share your comments or raise your questions. Lastly, the last icon that you will see is just the chat box on your screen, which we would like you to use to introduce yourself, as well as to keep the conversation going around what is being presented by our great speakers in the next 2.5 hours. So without spending a lot of time on this, I would like now to hand over to Louise, who is going to be the moderator. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kuselwa. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today, and welcome to the Global Campaign for Education and Education Out Loud webinar, Perspectives on the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report on Non-State Actors in Education. We are so pleased to co-organize this event with colleagues from Education Out Loud, Global Partnership for Education, and National Foundation for Education and Research. Thank you very much to you all for collaborating with us. And very briefly, as you all already know, the purpose of this webinar is to engage GCE members, partners, and other stakeholders around the Global Monitoring Report 2021-2022, which is entitled Non-State Actors in Education, Who Chooses and Who Loses. So the idea is that we have a very exciting and packed agenda today with lots of very interesting speakers and presentations that I will be introducing before each session of the webinar. So with no more preamble, I want to give the floor to Mr. Rafat Sabat, the President of the Global Campaign for Education, and then Mr. Imad Sabi, who works for Orphan-IBIS and who is a member of the Education Outlook team. They both will open the webinar. So over to you, Rafat.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you. Good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks to our EOL, UNESCO, GPE, and NEAR colleagues for co-organizing this event with us, and to our guest speakers and National Coalition for representing today. I am delighted to open this webinar, which is an opportunity to engage further with the 21-22 UNESCO Global Monitoring Report entitled Non-State Actors in Education, Who Chooses, Who Loses. First of all, I want to congratulate the Global Education Monitoring Report team and its director for putting together this important publication. The report is not only conceptually and methodologically sound, but also opens a wide range of opportunities to better understand the role of non-state actors in the provision of education. As the very first key message of the report stresses, there is no part of the education in which non-state actors are not involved. More specifically, the report stresses without non-state actors, the education of 350 million more children would fall to the responsibility of the state. I would strongly stress the education of children in all corners of the world is above all a state responsibility and must be free. This is what international human rights, notably the Child Convention, prescribes. However, as the report also shows, public education is not always free. Households account for 30% of total education spending globally and 39% in low and lower middle income countries. Overall, the Global Campaign for Education sees the report as an opportunity to reflect on the critical role played by non-state actors, and in particular non-profit actors, in the respect, protection, and fulfillment of the right to education. The report rightly highlights the multiple complexities and dilemmas that society as a whole face with the either welcoming or contesting the role of non-state actor in education. This is a rather complex choice between, for example, equity and the freedom of choice. While reading the report, I did remember Professor Katarina Tomasvitsky words. To paraphrase here, the market has concessions with nobody, so governments, family, community, international organization, and notably civil society organization should be critical about the kind of engagement with expect from the private actors. Education is a basic human right that cannot be simply sold in the market. We then must contest the rhetoric and the actions of those actors who want and indeed who are making profit for education, from education. If we do not do so, we will see more and more private companies and corporations selling education services and just forgetting, or better to say, ignoring that education is a human right. Partly because of many actors ignoring this, we have girls and boys, notably those with disabilities, those who belong to families with low income, children of migrants, asylum seekers, internally displaced people, and refugees, to name but a few groups excluded from our educational system. We must be aware that those voices suggesting that parents must pay for education to secure good quality and show commitment for the present and the future of their children are opening the doors for those actors that see education as a business opportunity. We must not forget that families in many countries of the world have to borrow money to pay for their children's education, which is supposed to be accessible for all and not a privilege. In the global campaign for education, we therefore strongly contest those social actors, especially national and international companies and corporations that use their power to promote for-profit education. I want to thank all the people involved in this production of this report for providing evidence and examples of the kinds of challenges students, families, communities, and all of us as active members of the civil society face to defend education as a basic right. Let me be clear. We are not calling for excluding non-state actors from education. We are very much aware that the private actors, for example, communities of faith, social organizations, and even companies are supporting families and communities' efforts to provide their children and youth with an education. This is notably the case of private actors supporting refugees' education in many places of the world. What we do strongly contest is those actors that promote the privatization and commercialization of education, and I invite you all to also context them in every local context. We must demand from government and the states an effective protection of everyone's right to education. Finally, I want to thank our National Foundation for Education Research colleagues, especially Dr. Katarzyna and her team, for their valuable contribution to the 21-22 Global Monitoring Report. We are so pleased. We are so pleased to have the opportunity to collaborate with the NEAR Research Organization engagement around non-state actors in education. Thank you very much, Dr. Kubacka, for your hard work leading this report. Thank you very much, Doctor, for your hard work in leading this report, and we look forward to continuing working with you in the future. Last but not least, thanks to all speakers for joining us today. And now I will give the floor to our colleague Imad Sabi from Education Out Loud. Over to you, Imad.
Thanks very much, Rifat. I also would like to join Rifat in welcoming you all to this webinar. We are very pleased to co-host it together with the Global Campaign for Education. Education Out Loud is a global partnership for education funded program to support civil society and to support its activism in the education sector. As part of our mandate, we see one of our roles as strengthening learning within civil society and contributing to knowledge exchange within civil society and other stakeholders. This particular webinar is on the GEM report on non-state actors. The Global Education Monitoring Report has been and continues to be an asset and an important resource for education stakeholders everywhere. We are really pleased that Manos Antoninis has joined us today to present this report and for us to have the opportunity as civil society to engage with it. I also want to thank the stellar group of speakers we have who will present different perspectives on the GEM report. As you are all aware, the descriptor non-state actors is a very, very broad category. And underneath it, there is civil society as well as for-profit providers of education services. We tried in designing this webinar to cover some aspects of this big category. And the speakers we have asked to be with us today will present perspectives from the point of view of the Abidjan Principles and the right to education, from the perspective of education in emergencies, and from the perspective of human rights accountability. Many thanks to all of them, including those who joined us at an early hour from the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Imad. Thank you very much. So now we are going to go into the content of our webinar. The first part is called an overview of the Global Education Monitoring Report and the FAIR and GCE perspectives. So we have 5 speakers for this panel. First of all, we are going to hear Mr. Manos Antoninis, the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report, UNESCO, who will present the main takeaways of the report. After his presentation, we are going to have an opportunity for a Q&A, so please be ready with your questions and comments and raise your hand, and my colleague Kuselwa and Salma will give you the floor. Over to you, Manos, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I apologize in advance for those of you who may have heard me presenting the part of those findings before, but I'll try to do best. I understand I have 15 minutes. Let me share my screen and get on the case. Just first of all, to acknowledge, of course, that we have had a chance with, I think at least the report, colleagues of mine, to present findings with the Global Campaign for Education in the United States. And we really appreciate, as Refat also said earlier, the work that the National Foundation for Education Research did in support engaging GC members in the preparation of this report. As you know, our report is always inspired by the Framework for Action. That's how our advisory board members select its different themes. And in the case of non-state actors, the motivation was again found in the Framework for Action, which had highlighted the crucial role of non-state actors in education, when it had said that the ambitious education goal cannot be achieved by governments alone. And yet, despite this understanding that fulfilling the right to education requires multiple stakeholders, non-state involvement in education generates passionate debate, particularly over 2 key concepts. First, the extent to which education is a public or a private good, a form of an investment or a form of a consumption. And secondly, how to interpret the right to education with respect to its implications for state and non-state actors' responsibilities. Arguments regarding efficiency, innovation, and equity are at the core of these debates, but these are debates that are characterized by mistrust and acrimony. There are two very different views of the world clashing, and it is rare to see agreement. Civil society organizations, teacher unions, businesses and their associations, NGOs, the media, philanthropies, political parties, academics, think tanks are among those who are trying to shape the discourse and influence the opinion in favor of one or the other position. The report's rallying call, Who Chooses, Who Loses, which we borrowed from a publication that appeared in the United States a quarter of a century ago, invites policymakers to question relationships with non-state actors in terms of fundamental choices around equity and freedom of choice, for instance, the two pillars of the right to education, between encouraging initiative and setting standards, between groups of varying means and needs, between immediate commitments under SDG 4 and those to be progressively realized. The report urges governments to see all institutions, students, and teachers as part of a single system, without turning their eyes away from privilege or exploitation. And efficiency and innovation, rather than being commercial secrets, should be diffused and practiced by all. The report starts by an unusual set of countries that we managed to put together to answer the question, what is the level of support in middle and high income countries on who has, or whether the government has the primary responsibility for providing school education. And we are familiar with such research primarily from high income countries. But for the first time, we were able to have access to views also from middle income countries. And as you see, while overall 9 in 10 people in these 34 countries believe that their primary responsibility rested with governments for education provision, there are some countries, the Philippines, for instance, and in particular India, where only 1 in 2 people, in fact less than 1 in 2, believe that this responsibility rests with governments. And that's why we will have a special regional edition of this report coming out in the summer. We wanted to probe further into these questions and in fact dispel what we found there to be a series of myths around state and non-state actors. The first is that it is simple and straightforward to distinguish between state and non-state actors. But in fact, non-state actors are really very diverse because they engage in education for multiple reasons: religion, pedagogy and views around it, profit, and the extent to which profit making is an objective of this involvement, and the diverse mixes in which these three and other motivations come into the picture are one major source of differentiation. The second is how non-state actors engage with the state. There's a large variety of full, partial, or no involvement of state in the ownership, management, or funding of these providers. And third, we also have, as this infographic shows, a variety of costs to the final user, the household, from no cost to low and ultimately very high fees available for parents to pay. That in itself is a good indication that we may not know, in fact, very well the precise extent of state involvement in education. Already you heard that we have a very large number of children being educated. That's the countable part. We know that at some point soon after the 2000, there was a rapid increase in the percentage of students that were enrolled in private institutions in primary and secondary education. Within a space of 10 years, this percentage increased by 7 points in primary and in secondary education, reaching 19% today in primary and 26% in secondary education. But it's true that it has relatively stagnated in the last few years. But the involvement of private actors is not limited just to provision, and that's exactly what makes it particularly interesting. Private actors and other non-state actors are involved in the curriculum, in textbooks, in assessments, in technology, in services, catering, for school feeding, for instance, and other support services in schools. And they're also involved, as we know, in the provision of private supplementary tuition. And beyond that, there's a big ongoing battle of influence that is happening as different actors try to change the minds of the public to be more or less in favor of non-state involvement. The third myth is that public education, which is our ideal and is the commitment of countries, is not necessarily equitable. In fact, we found through new research that households face very large costs of education, larger than perhaps we had even appreciated before. Globally, households account for 30% of total education spending. And in low and lower middle income countries, the percentage goes up to 39%. In several countries, it's $2 out of $3 in education are spent by families. That contrasts very much with high income countries where $1 in $6 or even less is spent on education, especially in primary and secondary education. Very little is spent out of pocket in rich countries, which may be a reason why we neglect this major challenge. Globally, about 8% of households borrow to pay for education, and that percentage rises to 12% in low-income countries and to over 30% in countries with extensive non-state education systems, such as Haiti, Kenya, the Philippines, and Uganda. But that gradually leads us also to the fourth myth. There are multiple ways through which the role of non-state actors characterizes education systems. We have identified four large categories. There are countries where still the role of non-state actors is very limited. Secondly, there is countries where the role of non-state actors has been historically, for cultural, often religious reasons, very significant. Third, there's a small group of countries that have actively tried to essentially give the non-state actor, and especially the private sector, a much bigger role. But fourth, and the one that is really of particular interest, especially to this webinar, is those countries, usually low and lower middle income countries, where there was a gradual expansion of the role of non-state actors. We trace that back to the fiscal challenges of the 1980s and 1990s, when many countries, due to structural adjustment, were forced to reduce spending in public services, including education, and a deterioration in quality started being observed. So people who had the ability to afford started moving out of the public education system, but also many families that were living in informal settlements in urban areas that were not being served by public schools had to find alternative solutions. And it's true that the vast majority of schools are single proprietor schools and emerged due to concerns about public school quality, even though often our attention falls on a relatively small set of profit-seeking chains of schools that have rightfully attracted the attention, but are still a relatively small, very small sometimes, percentage of schools in these countries. But that leads us then to a different range of myths. Many have portrayed this move to non-state providers as a sign and a signal that parents are free to choose the school they want based on good information about quality. In reality, the information that parents need to take such decision, even if they want it, is so complicated that, first of all, rarely exists. But even in the most sophisticated systems in some high-income countries where such information is available, in reality, parents do not base their decisions on such information. They base it on their desire for their children to be in a particular school, for the demographic characteristics. That's also confirmed in countries like Chile, where parental decisions have been found to be influenced by school demographics rather than by the academic reputation. And the related myth is that competition leads to school improvement. We know that competition is very important in many parts of social and economic life, but it may not work the same way in education. And in particular, we found that the opposite is often the case, where non-state schools are pandering to parental aspirations, for instance, changing the language of instruction to an international language because that appeals to be a sign of good quality, even though we know this is not a good sign of quality on average in any education system. The seventh and most studied myth is that private schools and universities are better. In reality, a simple naive comparison between outcomes in two different types of schools is never a sufficient signal of differences in quality, because the student intake, but also the school characteristics in terms of resources available are very different. Once we start taking those observable characteristics into account, the premium that private schools enjoy drops by 1/2 to 2/3, and that's before even taking into account unobservable characteristics of parental aspirations that are very hard to observe and could perhaps be reasonably expected to remove even a larger percentage of this premium that private schools appear to enjoy. Two myths related to expectations that have been raised about the private sector. The private sector has appeared, particularly in urban, densely populated areas. And what analysis in the report shows is that in low and middle income countries, the richest children are 10 times more likely to attend a private school than the poorest. It's a rate of 40% of the top quintile relative to 4% of the bottom quintile. And another myth to be dispelled is that the private sector can help solve the education financing gap, as some observers have been trying to argue. In reality, such direct contributions, with the exception, of course, of the household out-of-pocket payments, which are not necessarily leading us to achieve SDG 4, most of this spending actually goes to place children higher up the ladder, but that doesn't necessarily bring us any closer to ensuring that certain children remain in school and learn. What we find is that paying tax would have been a much more effective way of contributing to the achievement of SDG 4 by increasing the domestic resource budgets of countries. We find that in low and middle income countries, more tax is lost by tax evasion and avoidance than the aid that is received. And the private sector could also contribute by supporting skills development much more than currently is the case. Even in high income countries, we find that only 2% of the wage bill is spent on skills development, and perhaps also investing more in childcare at the workplace, which remains very, very rudimentary to this date. Finally, the report dispels the myth that regulations can address concerns about equity and quality. Very few countries has a comprehensive review of regulations at all levels of education in 211 education systems that you can find at the PIA website, shows that countries monitor and act upon segregation, selective school admission, out-of-pocket spending, private tutoring, or lobbying. Most regulations remain relatively at the surface. That leads us to 5 recommendations in this report, which I'm going to refer to in the next few slides. First, we remind the international community that all governments committed in 2015 to fulfill a promise to make 1 year of pre-primary and 12 years of primary and secondary education free. While publicly financed education did not need be publicly provided, governments must ensure the same conditions for all students. Government-funded schools should not be charging fees. Schools should not be selecting students, and we find that only 1 in 2 countries prevent selective admissions. And of course, even those that do, often schools find ways around to select their students. And we also argued that there is no space for profit-making in primary and secondary compulsory education. About 1 in 4 countries currently ban profit-making at these levels. Secondly, quality standards need to be established that apply to both state and non-state education institutions at the same time. And these should be standards that cover not just inputs, but also processes and results. Teachers should be valued as professionals in all schools. We find segregation of teaching working conditions in many countries. Quality assurance mechanisms should monitor and enforce these standards. And private tutoring should not be allowed to negatively affect system equity and quality. We found that only half of countries currently regulate private tutoring in some form. Governments need to apply common monitoring and support processes to state and non-state institutions. In fact, what we found is that regulations are often quite impractical and do not protect the more disadvantaged communities. Governments need to have a clear vision how to engage non-state actors, and they need to be honest about the causes of the phenomenon they are trying to regulate. That calls for simple, transparent, and efficient regulations that do not become a source for corruption, and also encourage schools to come and register. In many large sub-Saharan African cities, many schools choose not to register. Finally, a couple of recommendations on how to view innovation. Innovation is a word that's often not very clearly understood, but the simple fact is that there is no actor with a monopoly on good ideas. Essentially, the report is calling for providers not to try to outcompete each other in education, and for governments to search, share, test, and adopt good ideas that are found in all schools. And as I mentioned earlier, not to be treat those as commercial secrets that are only for the benefit of some students. And related to that, the report calls on the need to maintain transparency and the integrity of public education policy processes. All voices, and your voice, of course, as Education Out Loud, as Global Campaign for Education is particularly important in that, need to be given equal chance in such processes. And governments need to monitor and safeguard against lobbying and revolving door practices which try to influence in an unfair way how decisions are being taken. That brings me to an end, and I know I'm just a little bit over my time limit, but I'm going to plead with you, given that the Global Campaign for Education has stayed in support of this initiative, just to mention that the GEM reports and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics have over the last couple of years worked very hard to ensure that all countries commit to or fulfill a commitment that was made in the Framework for Action in 2015 for all countries to set benchmarks, intermediate targets for SDG 4. We worked with the Technical Cooperation Group on SDG 4 indicators to set 7 indicators of SDG 4 framework that could be benchmarked, and called on countries to make national contributions out of their national sector plans, essentially mimicking in education the approach of national determined contributions that the climate change actor set a few years ago under the Paris Agreement. This is a very important step that basically concluded in November. A publication was launched in January on the International Day of Education, which summarized the results of this process. And you can find the data also at the UIS's Global Education Observatory. The key findings here are that 45% of countries committed to benchmarks for at least some of those 7 indicators. 13% of countries belonging to the European and the Caribbean communities also participated, and another 8% were on course of submitting, and some of them have since submitted their benchmark on this process. The remaining countries, some have planned with targets, some have planned without targets, some have no plans at all. And that's why we have called, issued a second call in view of the high-level political forum this year and the Transforming Education Summit for the remaining countries to also submit their benchmarks for all 7 indicators. We will count very much on the Global Campaign for Education support and of the Global Partnership for Education support that both endorsed this process in the January publication, because this is really be the key for ensuring that after schools have now reopened, governments can remain committed to particular targets over the next few years. The benchmarks have been set for 2025 and 2030. And that brings me to an end. thank you very much for your attention. Apologies for taking a bit extra time, and I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you, Manuel. Thank you very much for your presentation. This is probably the third time I heard your presentation, but it is great. You always bring new ideas to think about. So I now we will the floor to people who are attending this call. Any questions? Please open your micro or put in the text box. Kuselwa, do you see any hand or any comment or question? I see Delphine Dorsey. Please, Delphine, go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Manos, for the presentation. I have a question. I hope you can respond today, but otherwise we can follow up. In the report, you said like for-profit making is not possible in primary and secondary education. So I guess the conclusion is this is possible in higher education, and what will be the reasoning for that? Because I can understand there are more private actors in higher education, but for profit making in another step. So if you have an answer, I'm interested. Thanks.
Yes, of
Thank
course.
you, Delphine.
I can answer now.
Yes, please.
We said specifically that no profits would be tolerated, and that of course has been a relatively controversial, perhaps the most controversial recommendation of all those that were in the report this year. And we did find that it was consistent with a range of reasons behind it. If countries have committed to free and compulsory education, clearly, if education is to be compulsory, it does make sense for profit to be part of this picture. Ultimately, education systems, if you look at them, there are no miracles. Often, what we're being presented is that there are providers out there that can do a much better job than public schools can do. And in reality, that's the myth, that's the seventh myth in particular that we try to emphasize. That's simply not the case. There are no miracles in education. At the end of the day, you need good quality teachers who are available in the system to teach, whether they teach in the public or the private school. They should be available for all learners ever in the system. Innovations. The scope for innovation education is quite limited. Again, there are no miracles. There might be some good ideas, and there's constantly good ideas flowing and new ways of doing things, but all these changes are incremental. Even if such innovations are made, they're not there to be kept, as I mentioned several times already, as a secret that some may benefit. They need to be, by definition, spread to all providers. But we limited the recommendation to compulsory education, because it's true that post-compulsory education is not one to which every government has committed to universal provision for everyone. And it's true also that there are a lot of private good elements, private good qualities of post-secondary education, that it is very difficult for governments to be able to satisfy the needs of everyone for free. Yes, there are public good, strong public good elements, civic outcomes of great importance, and many others. I mean, the improvements in the capacity of countries to do research, to promote the technology, the adoption or the development. All these are extremely important public good elements. But at the same time, there is a very strong private return at these levels of education, that it is very hard for any government to satisfy the need of every single person who might want to. So that's where it becomes much more complicated to ensure education that is free of charge for every single person. So that's why we limited the recommendation, at least to that level of education to which all countries have committed, that education will be free and compulsory.
Thank you, Manos. Wondering if there is another hand, people who want to make a question. Do you see anything in the chat box, Kuselwa?
No, Louise, we don't have any questions in the chat box, and
Okay.
we don't have any other hand up.
Okay, but maybe this is a good opportunity for us to ask a question. Manos, for people who have been working on issues around the right to education, it's very common to hear about the kind of not clear boundaries between private and public education and the problems of comparing the outcomes of private and public schools. My question is, did you learn something that you didn't know before the report? Something that they say, oh, that is new for me. And what are the implications if that is the case?
That's a good question. I think quite a few team members were quite well versed on this topic. Usually we come and we start the preparation of the general report as complete, generalists, not knowing anything whatsoever about the topic. I can say that in the team we had a few colleagues who knew a little bit more. So the issue was not so much the new things, although we did come across very interesting cases of how the role of non-state actors is much less visible and behind, sort of closed doors, or influence that is very, very indirect. For instance, the discussion we had in the influence chapter of the report, to which I didn't mention and I didn't refer to very much, about how the narrative that technology companies use, for instance, to influence governments, is always based on this high level of optimism that there's always a scope for a market and for the returns to investment in that area to grow, which have not proven to be true in practice. That's a very interesting case of how people try to influence governments by their narratives. Of course, it was also a very interesting piece of research that I think Casca is going to present in a minute. And that, I think, was also very interesting. In that sense, I think what I would say is that for us, what was the most important steps was how to conceptualize, how to bring the different arguments together, how to give a picture that is unified, and also how we conceptualize non-state actors, because just as the blurring of boundaries between state and non-state actors was very clear, also the blurring of boundaries within non-state actors are also very interesting. But I think I should not speak more on that, and I think I should let others refer to those findings of the report, given that they're more relevant for the discussion today.
Thank you, Manos. This is wonderful to have you on board for this evening, and always I enjoy hearing you. So now it's time to hear alternative voices on the report, and so I will introduce our 4 next speakers in this first session. First of all, we are going to hear Dr. Katarzyna Kubaka, the Research Director of the National Foundation for Education Research, who will present the paper Civil Society Organization Engagement Around Non-State Actors in Education. I am so pleased to say that GC had the opportunity to collaborate in the preparation of this report, and thank you, Casca, for this opportunity. I'm happy to engage with you in more research in the future. After Dr. Kubaka, we are going to hear Dr. Ileana Lopriori, who is a board member of CLADE and the president of the Venezuelan chapter of the World Organization for Early Childhood Education. And then we will invite Kwame Paulin Jr., the National Coordinator of the Ivorian Network for the Promotion of Education for All. And last but not least, closing this first part of the webinar, we are going to hear Mr. Emmanuel Hawk, the National Coordinator of the Campaign for Popular Education. So thank you again for joining us, and over to you, Casca. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Luis Eduardo. Thank you to GC for the invitation and for collaboration on this research project, which formed the background paper for the Global Education Monitoring Report. I will start sharing my screen very shortly. Thank you. So I just wanted to say that the research I will present has been conducted together with the wider NFER team, and like I mentioned already, in partnership with GC, and many thanks to Luis Eduardo in particular, but also to the coalitions that participated in our survey and the interviews. Just to double check, Luis Eduardo, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so to start off, let me start with what was the goal of our approach and sort of what was the goal of our research, sorry. And this was to investigate the positions and the strategies that civil society organizations take around this very important issue of non-state actor engagement in education. We wanted to know how do they engage in policy dialogue and awareness raising, as well as influence around this topic. What strategies do they use and what common patterns emerge across the strategies? How have the different actors impacted the provision of education through their engagement in the view of civil society organization? And as our research was conducted around mid-2020, we had an opportunity to sense check and investigate the early observations and attitudes around the impact of COVID-19 at that stage. We focus on civil society organizations working within the Global Campaign for Education across the main regions. So we wanted to cover all the main regions and countries at different resource levels, so kind of commonly referred to as high, middle, and low income countries. We conducted our research around spring, autumn 2020. So as today is the first day of spring, it's almost 2 years ago that we started. And we looked at 3 main sources of information. So first of all, we conducted a desk-based review of literature, the different documents from the civil society organizations, and we created background case studies for our interviews and survey. We sent the survey to the 93 coalitions working within the Global Campaign of Education. And we conducted interviews with 10 civil society organizations. Most of them, with the exception of the Netherlands, were GCE members. These were in Australia, Bangladesh, Brazil, Chile, Cote d'Ivoire, India, the Netherlands, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Tanzania. I'm happy to know that they will be sharing their views after my presentation, some of them. As Manos already mentioned, the non-state actor definition that the Global Education Monitoring Report took is quite a broad one, and we followed it, mindful of the think piece and the concept note that preceded the 2021-22 Global Education Monitoring Report. So we consider a broad range of actors that are involved in both provision, the financing, the governance, and influence and innovation of education. And in the last category of influence and innovation, that also includes civil society organizations which are engaged in education. So that is an interesting kind of perspective on that our report provides, because in some ways it's a meta view, given that the civil society organizations that we partnered with and that we interviewed are also part of that sphere and work in the sphere of education and non-state actors engagement. I will present an overview of our findings, but of course it's just a snapshot in the 15 minutes. I will try to stick to the time. And I do invite everyone to look at the full report, which is published on the Global Education Monitoring Report website alongside other background papers. It's a wonderful resource that I think sometimes is maybe a bit overlooked by the main, really important report as well. But there's a lot of background information on those pages, including our full report. So one of the main findings, and I think that's already something that's been highlighted or alluded to in Manu's presentation and our discussion so far, is that the civil society organizations that we interviewed had quite a nuanced perspective on non-state actors' engagement. And I think perhaps that's quite surprising to some people who are not engaged in working with civil society organizations. They might think that there's a universally maybe negative view, but no. What we found is that while all our interviewed organizations were against profit making, of course, and they were generally more critical towards sort of stricter private sector. They recognized that, for instance, not-for-profit actors do make a very important contribution to providing or supporting the right to education. Our interviews revealed, of course, that coalitions are aware of the context they work with, and they're very familiar with the sort of shortcomings of the government. And while they still see, of course, the government as the main government's obligation to provide the right to education, they do see that in the kind of meantime, when the situation is not ideal, non-state actors provide very important services. As already mentioned, the distinction between the private and public was not clear-cut in our interviews. The civil society organizations in the different countries gave multiple examples where these lines between public and private are blurry. In some cases, perhaps the Netherlands is a good example where the public education system has a very strong sort of non-state actor engagement. And in all our research, we found that the context in each country was very important in understanding the work and the challenges and the opportunities that civil society organizations face in that area. So as I already mentioned, that there was a nuanced perception of kind of the role of non-state actors depending on their type. And in this figure, I just wanted to give a snapshot of that. So the figure shows sort of responses around private schools and chains in green and community and NGO schools in purple. So the two different types of non-state actors. And the bars show the extent to which civil society organizations that we surveyed responded that the two different actors contributed to the services in these areas. So in terms, for instance, of providing services to improve public education as a whole, there was some difference, but not as much of a difference in terms of how civil society organizations saw private schools and chains and community and NGO schools in general. They saw the community and NGO schools as kind of having more of a role in that area, but the difference is relatively small. However, for instance, in providing education in hard to reach areas, which I think quite often is something that maybe private actors would boast about and would sort of give as their advantage, civil society organizations that we surveyed responded that they did not see that much of a role there and kind of that much of an impact from private schools and chains, whereas much more impact from community and NGO schools. And across the different areas, such as providing better quality education at a lower cost, providing education at specific levels, which maybe are not catered by the government, or providing education to the most marginalized learners, our respondents were much more likely to indicate that community and NGO schools were playing these roles rather than private schools and chains. Sorry. In terms of the responses around the main themes that the civil society organizations worked in the area, the absolutely main theme, and I think that is no surprise, was concerned with equity and inclusion in education. So all the work, or most of the work that the organizations we interviewed or responded that they do in this area of engagement of non-state actors is very much through the lens of equity and inclusion and, of course, right to education, which is not surprising given the mission of Global Campaign for Education as well. And so the organizations are working very much around kind of understanding and limiting the negative impact of non-state actors on right to education and equitable quality education in general. And what we found is that in their work, they target the different stakeholders in education. A lot of the work, and probably the majority of the work across regions, targets the public, but almost as much is around the national and subnational policymakers. So especially in federal states, of course, there was a lot of attention that civil society organizations that we interviewed paid to regional policymakers. Slightly less around education influences, such as international organizations, as well as donors. And these are some of the examples of activities that civil society organizations undertake in this area of non-state engagement. So a lot of the organizations that we surveyed mentioned that they create the work focuses on creating awareness of non-state actors' impact on the quality of education. equally many put emphasis on shaping public policies regarding this area in education. And as kind of I highlighted before, much less so working with national and subnational government on developing and enforcing regulations around non-state actors' engagement in education. So part of it, as our interviews revealed, might be because in many cases, civil society organizations are not maybe invited to the table where these regulations are taking place. And so that was a challenge that some of our interviews highlighted. As I mentioned, we were conducting the biggest chunk of our research in kind of mid-2020. So while we looked into the impact of COVID, little did we know that this was still very early days of the pandemic. But still, we were able to see kind of survey some of the impact of COVID that the civil society organizations revealed, both around their own work and this area of non-state engagement in general. Some of the main ways in which COVID at that point had impacted education and non-state engagement that the civil society organizations mentioned were around non-state schools closing due to fee losses, non-state actors working with the government to provide distance learning solutions, and of course this only exacerbated later on, and non-state actors expanding their role through education technology, and again we know now that that continued. And just a few organizations at that point mentioned that the COVID did not affect non-state actors' engagement in education. Some of the general reflections around this topic of the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic that I could present are that already there, civil society organizations in different countries were reviewing the growing role of information technology providers and companies in education. This was across the different sort of countries and resources, so both in low and middle and high income countries. This was quite a strong message and consistent message from our organizations. And some concerns around that in the sense that these companies were positioning themselves as the sort of, like Manos already mentioned, this perfect, providing innovation and solution to the problems that the government was struggling with at the time, or governments, and also concerns around the fact that if regulations were often outdated around these technology providers and were struggling to keep up with any updates. Organizations gave us examples of changes to the ways of their working and also to the ways of working of non-state actors. For instance, among some of the organizations that we interviewed, they were saying that there was more focus on the kind of grass movement connections in their work. And in some cases, that created opportunities, at least at these early stages of pandemic, because these organizations were well connected to kind of the general public or to grass movements. And so we're often able to mobilize these connections with the public more so than, for instance, the government. However, many civil society organizations mentioned already there that either the COVID pandemic had at that point negative impact on their budgets, or that they were fearing that it would have negative impact on their budgets and generally government's budgets. So indirectly them for that as well. And through the funding opportunities that were limiting as budgets were shrinking. And the context that many civil society organizations we interviewed provided to us, and indeed that's something that's been confirmed through research on the longer term effects of pandemic, was that of a growing inequality due to pandemic and heightened costs paid by those who were already struggling before the pandemic and those who were already either marginalized or at the risk of marginalization in education. And finally, some reflections on our main findings. As mentioned before, all our organizations were working through the lens of right to education, so equity and inclusion as the core focus of their work in terms of non-state actors' engagement. And so that's why their views were nuanced. They were really looking at not so much you know, the sort of whether actors were state or non-state, but to what extent they were contributing positively or negatively to the equity and inclusion in education. Civil society organizations that we worked with on this piece mentioned the importance of regulations, but quite often much more emphasis was put on the implementation of the regulations. So in many cases, in different countries, organizations mentioned that, you know, the regulations were maybe not so bad, but their implementation was really lacking behind. And then in other cases, perhaps regulations existed, but were quickly becoming outdated, especially around the technology provision. And again, just a sort of general comment, which is not surprising to those who are part of civil society organizations or work with civil society organizations, but maybe not something that people realize that well if they're not working in this topic, is that the organizations we interviewed had a very good understanding of the gaps between the legislation and the field reality. So the discourse that we had was very much based on what was happening in the field and what was actually happening on the ground, rather than perhaps, you know, more kind of normative discussions. And especially as COVID was sort of early stages of the pandemic were taking place, this was very much highlighted in terms of the learning loss already there experienced by learners. And a number of interviewees also highlighted the role of media as another non-state actor in raising awareness about rules and regulations related to non-state actors. And some organizations we interviewed also mentioned that they were actively engaging with media and trying to sort of focus their attention to the key issues around education and around non-state actors' engagement, especially where there were challenges to equity and inclusion. So I'll finish on that, and hopefully I stuck more or less to my time limit. And thank you again for your attention, and to GC's members for a contribution to our research. And yes, please feel free to reach out in case of any questions or comments now or later. Thank you.
Thank you, Casca. It's such a challenge to present the report in just 15 minutes, that you have done wonderfully. So now time to hear Dr. Ileana Lopriori. And please hold your question for the end of this panel. Over to you, Ileana. Coselva, can you please check if Ileana has a technical issue?
Sí. Muy buenos
¿Estás ahí,
días.
Ileana? Okay, good. Go ahead, please.
Muy buenos días. Para nosotros es un placer poder participar en este evento porque este informe de seguimiento de la educación al mundo 2021 que coloca en el tapete a los actores no estadales en la educación con esa pregunta tan reflexiva como ¿quién elige y quién pierde? Nos coloca este enfoque del tema, nos ha dado la posibilidad de revisar su impacto y su incidencia, de analizar el papel y la participación de estos actores abordando aspectos que son claves en esta actividad no estatal, como la provisión, la regulación, los procesos de financiamiento y la incidencia e influencia que tiene la educación. Para nosotros como coalición latinoamericana es importante también enmarcar en las condiciones en nuestra región, condiciones de pobreza, de exclusión, de violaciones de derechos humanos, de desempleo, de informalidad, de degradación ambiental, de un modelo extractivista que está vigente en la región, de condiciones diversas, de excluidos, indígenas, migrantes, vulnerabilidad, que se agravó durante el periodo de la pandemia y que ha tenido una crisis importante en el sistema educativo. Entonces, este informe ha llegado en un momento propicio para poder analizar la incidencia y la respuesta también de estos actores no estadales frente a estas grandes necesidades. Partimos de un planteamiento frente a la mayor desigualdad. El apoyo, la inversión y el financiamiento debe ser mayor. O sea, la equidad no es igualdad de financiamiento. La equidad tiene que ver con el aporte justo y necesario para resolver estas desigualdades sociales y educativas que tenemos en la región. Queremos compartir la coincidencia que conseguimos con 4 aspectos fundamentales del informe. Coincidimos en la necesaria fortalecimiento de los sistemas de educación pública, los cuales deben ser una prioridad y para lo que sabemos que existe apoyo mundial. Coincidimos en que las escuelas privadas no son la panacea para solucionar estas grandes crisis en los procesos de aprendizaje y que pueden tener o no impactos negativos en todo el sistema, especialmente en los procesos de equidad y en la calidad. El tercer aspecto de coincidencia es que definitivamente la participación de los actores privados requieren una regulación permanente, sólida, consistente, que garantice la equidad y que verdaderamente focalice y proteja a los más vulnerables de la sociedad. Y cuarto, ratificamos la responsabilidad de garantizar el derecho a la educación para todos que tienen los estados para proveer la protección de la equidad en la educación, tanto en los procesos de financiación, la calidad, la gobernanza, la innovación y la formulación de políticas. Entonces, este informe llega en un momento muy pertinente en América Latina y el Caribe, dado este crecimiento casi desmesurado de la privatización de la educación. Y nos hemos hecho reflexiones y repreguntas sobre ¿es adecuado o idónea esta financiación? ¿Apuntala a las necesidades reales y prioritarias de la región? Analizamos los costos de recibir este apoyo financiero, pero muchas veces viene acompañada de enfoques y paradigmas ideológicos de mercado que potencian esa competencia educativa, que están descontextualizados del apoyo, lo que incide verdaderamente en el logro de la equidad, de la inclusión y de esas perspectivas que defendemos de protección integral y de la asunción de la educación como derecho humano. Entonces, esta reflexión, colocar en el tapete desde una postura crítica, ha sido bien importante para nosotros. Estudios de la CLADE han acompañado en paralelo este informe de la YEN, estudios como la competencia entre las escuelas impulsadas por políticas privatizadoras, se ha traducido frecuentemente en un aumento de la discriminación educativa y de la segregación escolar. Es decir, nos ha generado ratificar de que existe un fuerte apoyo a la educación pública en todo el mundo y que frente a esta gran desigualdad que es mayor, como decía al inicio, debe ser el apoyo en la educación de forma correspondiente y pertinente. Entonces, no se trata, y aquí tenemos una reflexión, no se trata del ejercicio del derecho humano a la educación de la disponibilidad, sino de ratificar la perspectiva del derecho humano. El sector privado no está siendo una solución a los grandes desafíos relacionados con el acceso. Se ha profundizado las inequidades y nos los preguntamos permanentemente. Es decir, reflexionamos sobre el informe, pero post-informe nos seguimos preguntando sobre las inequidades educativas en acceso. La presencia en las zonas urbanas es mayoritaria de estas organizaciones y sabemos que en las zonas rurales, indígenas, migrantes, se reproduce la invisibilización de estos sectores que no participan, que no ejercen su derecho fundamental a la educación. Y nos preguntamos, en esos espacios, ¿dónde están los actores no estadales de la educación? Ratificamos los mitos que mencionan el informe, como que el sector privado es una solución, que es un mito también que las escuelas, los espacios no estadales ofrecen una mayor calidad que las escuelas públicas. Sabemos que es un mito erróneo, que la competencia conduce a la mejora escolar. Defendemos esa necesidad y respeto y legitimidad a la diferenciación, a la diversidad que es necesaria y que nos transforma esos conceptos de calidad que son vistos como un bien en el mercado. Es necesario, y este es un cuarto aspecto que es fundamental, es imprescindible que se precise la regulación que se ejerce en el monitoreo de cómo están ejerciendo el acceso, equidad y calidad o gobernanza de estos espacios, no solo privados, sino organizaciones no estatales. La participación de los actores privados no es un consejo, es imprescindible, requiere de estos marcos regulatorios que sean sólidos, consistentes y permanentes, que no se reduzcan a los momentos iniciales de apertura de licencias y de aprobación de funcionamiento o del control de las tarifas. El proceso de regulación debe ser mucho más integral, debe acompañar, debe certificar los procesos de acceso, de equidad y de calidad. Se debe, por tanto, priorizar en todo momento la educación pública. Cómo sumar o cómo reconducir a estos actores no estatales para fortalecer la amplitud de la educación, la amplitud y todo lo que pueda tener como potencia la educación pública. Los estados, por supuesto, estamos invitando a los estados a que puedan solicitar las orientaciones de los principios de Abiyán y tenemos algunas, para cerrar, algunas recomendaciones que son fundamentales. Primero, centrarnos en asumir que la educación es un derecho humano y desde esta perspectiva se transforma también toda la plataforma ideológica que tienen estas organizaciones no estatales. Fomentar la diversidad de opciones formativas para quienes más lo necesitan. Y se le da la bienvenida y la apertura a todas esas generaciones de ideas y opciones formativas que puedan apoyar, pero que se redirijan a las que verdaderamente se necesitan, no que reproduzcan las desigualdades ya existentes. Tercero, la necesidad de generar un sistema de monitoreo mundial, regional, nacional, local, que permita una regulación más cercana de estas organizaciones no estatales. Revisar, y esto fue un aspecto fundamental, que es revisar el crecimiento de las corporaciones no estatales en la región y en el mundo, que asumen y que vacían de sentidos a la educación y que convierten a la misma en un bien que se ofrece en el mercado de servicios. La educación no es un servicio, es un derecho humano. Y una gran sugerencia para el cierre es que nosotros aspiramos que los siguientes reportes de la YEN, a lo que de verdad que celebramos el colocar en el tapete esta temática tan importante, solicitamos la importancia de la participación de las y los docentes en todas las fases de elaboración de los informes. No queremos participar al final para valorar los aportes o no aportes, queremos participar a lo largo de todo el proceso, porque también esto es un derecho humano como lo es la participación. Agradecemos a todos los aportes que nos ha generado estas posibilidades de pensamiento crítico y de ver otras posibilidades esperanzadoras que tiene este informe. Y bueno, continuamos en la reflexión que continúa de manera propositiva para asegurar que este derecho humano a la educación se concrete. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Liliana. Thank you very much. I am sure people will have questions for you at the end. So, Kwame Pauline Jr., over to you.
Oui, bonjour. Rebonjour.
Bonjour.
Je peux aller?
Go ahead, please.
OK, d'accord. Je voudrais donc d'abord remercier tous les organisateurs de nous avoir donc associés à ce panel-là. Nous avons donc contribué justement donc de par nos observations, nos interventions à ce rapport. Et on a voulu utiliser notre antenne pour étayer un point précis relativement donc à l'influence donc des acteurs, d'un groupe d'acteurs dans le secteur éducation-formation en Côte d'Ivoire. Et il s'agit ici des fondateurs d'établissements scolaires au niveau surtout donc du secondaire, qui ont réussi par, on va dire, on ne sait pas quelle magie, donc faire adopter un arrêté qui a institué ce qu'on appelle donc les frais complémentaires. Il faut dire que l'État de Côte d'Ivoire, vu les effectifs donc grandissants d'élèves, a eu donc recours aux établissements privés pour donc héberger les élèves après donc la classe de CM2. Malheureusement, l'instauration donc de cet arrêté-là fait que les enfants qui sont donc affectés par l'État, les enfants méritants qui sont donc affectés par l'État dans cet établissement-là ne subissent pas justement les mêmes traitements parce que leurs parents sont confrontés à des frais très souvent exorbitants qui leur sont exigés avant donc de pouvoir intégrer ces établissements-là. C'est ce qu'on appelle donc chez nous ici les frais complémentaires. Évidemment, ça pose plusieurs problèmes. Le premier problème que ça pose, ce sont les violations de toutes les normes qui existent, à commencer par les normes internationales, les conventions, les résolutions, etc. Au niveau national, donc, la Constitution est violée par cet arrêté-là, les décrets sont violés, les conventions même signées entre l'État et les acteurs privés-là, parce que la Convention dit que les enfants qui sont donc affectés par l'État dans ces établissements-là sont entièrement à la charge de l'État. Et donc, cet arrêté-là, justement, vient remettre en cause tout ce qui a été donc obtenu et acquis au profit donc des parents qui ont leurs enfants donc affectés dans ces établissements privés-là. Évidemment, ça pose un problème d'égalité et aussi un problème d'équité. Mais la conséquence de tout cela, c'est qu'on a vu fleurir dans le privé vraiment une masse d'établissements parce que ces frais complémentaires-là, ajoutés à cela donc aux subventions octroyées par l'État à ces établissements privés-là, font que ces établissements privés sont tout à fait, on va dire, bénéfiques à leur niveau, relativement donc à leur activité. Ils se basent justement, pour beaucoup d'entre eux, sur cette manne-là qui découle donc de l'affectation des enfants dans ces établissements-là pour agrandir leur chiffre d'affaires, ou donc fructifier justement dans d'autres affaires. Et quand vous regardez très bien la courbe là, en bleu, vous avez donc les écoles privées, les écoles publiques, et en rouge, les écoles privées. Et vous voyez très bien qu'il y a donc un accroissement du nombre d'établissements privés au détriment donc des établissements donc publics. Pourquoi? Parce que tout le monde a intérêt à pouvoir donc investir dans le privé parce que ça fait gagner énormément d'argent. Ça, c'est dans l'enseignement secondaire général. L'enseignement secondaire technique, c'est encore catastrophique. Depuis donc des décennies, vous voyez qu'il n'y a pratiquement pas de construction d'établissements secondaires techniques. Par contre, au niveau donc du privé, les acteurs privés donc construisent énormément et reçoivent donc énormément donc en France. De 2021, pour l'heure, il n'y a seulement que qui ne sont pas encore touchés par ce phénomène-là, mais le secondaire, le supérieur et les acteurs privés parce qu'il y a énormément de... Qu'est-ce que l'action que nous avons menée par rapport donc à cela? Évidemment, nous avons participé et contribué donc à plusieurs études d'éducation. Nous avons nous-mêmes fait donc une enquête sur les prix pratiqués par les établissements secondaires privés là, vraiment catastrophiques parce que ce sont des prix qui sont... Nous avons adopté donc une position que nous avons fait connaître à tous les acteurs, y compris donc l'État, pour leur indiquer clairement que nous sommes opposés donc à ces frais-là et à cette mafia-là, on va le dire. Lors de l'élaboration du plan sectoriel, nous avons donc fait des plaidoyers pour qu'à l'intérieur de ce plan sectoriel-là, on puisse inscrire le fait qu'on puisse encadrer justement ces établissements privés-là qui foisonnent donc dans ce territoire donc qui varie. Lors des différentes revues sectorielles aussi, nous utilisons notre temps d'antenne parce que nous intervenons là-bas aussi pour à chaque fois revenir sur la thématique pour démontrer et montrer les méfaits donc de ces frais complémentaires là sur donc les enfants, surtout les enfants des familles pauvres, les enfants des familles donc déshérités. Et puis, à l'occasion de l'adoption des principes d'Abidjan, nous avons donc mené une série donc, de plaidoyers et d'actions de renforcement des capacités à l'endroit de la société civile, des médias, des parlementaires et des responsables de l'éducation nationale pour leur indiquer qu'effectivement, le droit à l'éducation, ce n'est pas un droit qui doit être en l'air, mais c'est véritablement un droit qui doit s'exercer au quotidien pour tous les enfants de ce pays-là. Au nombre des obstacles, vraiment à notre travail de plaidoyer, relativement donc à cette thématique-là, il y a l'instabilité politique depuis donc plusieurs décennies qui fait que la question de l'éducation souvent est obligée donc d'être reléguée au calendrier grec parce que il faut donc parler sécurité, il faut donc parler donc politique, voilà, arrangement politique, etc. Ensuite, nous avons aussi la natalité galopante. Nous avons beaucoup de naissances en Côte d'Ivoire qui font que toutes les planifications de l'État justement donc, sont dépassées et nécessairement donc le privé devient donc, on va dire, cet acteur-là qui devient, on va dire, incontournable dans la sphère. Et puis, autre chose, vous avez la présence d'hommes politiques, d'auteurs politiques parmi les acteurs privés. Et ça, c'est vraiment l'un des gros obstacles parce que tous les plaidoyers, vous avez en face de vous, donc, ceux qui devaient normalement vous écouter, qui devaient normalement vous appuyer, qui se trouvent être donc des acteurs privés et qui ont des établissements privés et qui n'ont pas intérêt justement à ce que les choses puissent évoluer. Et puis, malheureusement aussi, il y a des enseignants et des personnes d'encadrement aussi qui sont parmi ces acteurs privés-là et qui rendent encore plus compliqué donc, et plus difficile donc, le travail donc, de la société civile sur cette thématique-là. Donc, voilà un peu en gros ce que je voulais dire sur ce point. Et puis, pour finir avec donc, le rapport, il faut dire que ce rapport est très important, très intéressant, parce qu'il permet donc d'avoir une vue globale sur l'influence des acteurs non étatiques sur le secteur. C'est vraiment très important pour notre plaidoyer. Ce rapport aussi partage donc diverses opinions de bien donc ailleurs et qui pourraient donc nous servir dans notre travail au quotidien. Comme j'avais 8 minutes, je vais m'arrêter là. S'il y a des questions, on pourrait donc aller plus en profondeur. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Kwame. Thank you very much. Now I will give the floor to Enamul. Please, all speakers, bear in mind about the time. So 8 minutes for you, Enamul, now. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. I'm Enamul Haq from Kempe, Bangladesh. I'd like to reflect on the GEM report 2021 based on our engagement. Particularly, Bangladesh has taken part in the process, and there are substantial section on Bangladesh in the regional report. So to reflect on, I'm taking up some of the issues from the regional report and reflecting on the issues. First of all, the report tried to give some framework for identifying the education sector, who are the state actors and who are the non-state actors. And it comprises of qualitative method that include literature review, survey, and key informant interview. Kempe as national coalition was indirectly part of the process in developing the national report and directly contributed to some of the regional and global process. The vice chairperson of Kempe was the team member of the regional report. Kempe has participated in this survey and also part of the key informant interview. We have also contributed to identify some key stakeholders and linking them with the research team. So these are some of the overview of the report. If you look at the size of the non-state actors in education, there are 44 million learners, excluding the Qaumi Madrasa. This is one special type of religious education institution. So excluded that, almost 42% of the student enroll in fully supported by state institution, around 38% in non-government institution, which are supported by the government, and 20% absolutely non-state institution. It comprises of private institution and NGO-run institution. And this is the classification at different level from ECC to technical and professional education. So if you look at the secondary level, that highest portion of the secondary level institution is highly relied on the government supported, but run by the non-state sector and private sector. Some of the critical issues identified by the study, the issue of holistic view of educational development. So it correctly reflected the parallel streams in education in Bangladesh because of the socio-economic division, or structure, and political dynamics. There are subsector plan, and along with some discrete project. So it lacks kind of comprehensive holistic education sector plan, although there is some initiative to develop a country level education sector plan, so which is evolving. With regard to structural and operational issues, there are issue of adequacy of resource allocation. I think it is common for many of the countries. Decentralization and effective governance. Then Comprehensive Education Act and formulation of Permanent Education Commission. This is a very critical debate in Bangladesh. We have enacted a policy back in 2010, but we are yet to develop the Comprehensive Act. And there is a recommendation for enacting a permanent commission that is also pending. Partnership building among state and non-state actors, it has two dimensions. One is profit seeking and one is CSO led. So now we can see the expansion of the profit seeking one, and we can see the kind of shrinking of CSO initiative. There are issues of curriculum, teaching learning process, and assessment. If you look at the National Student Assessment Report, we observe a declining trend in achieving quality, although our enrollment is increasing. Teachers' education and their continuous professional development is another issue. There is issue related to pre-primary education, market responsive skills development, non-formal education, and lifelong learning. There are other disparity issues. About 2.6 million children are still out of school for various reasons. There are issues of working children, persons with disability, family poverty and hidden cost of education, a rising trend of early marriage during the pandemic, building a common foundation of knowledge due to diverse stream and quality, a rising trend of elite patronized school, kind of private schools. Many of them are run by the government supported institutions, and hard time of the kindergartens during the pandemic. There are diverse actors and political economy of education issues. For example, the debate of right to education issues in the lens of Abidjan principle and experience of Assar. So I think that this is a critical issue. We need to think about what Abidjan principle says and what Assar report says. Abidjan principle report highly focused on banning the privatization and commercialization of education, and Assar has demonstrated kind of community-led initiative. None of them actually promote the commercialization of education. However, the tone in the report seems these two are dichotomous and there are some tension. We need to dig down more about it. There are issues of separation of power and in education governance. I'd like to pick up one small issue, that how diverse stakeholders perceive about the importance of non-state actors in education. With regard to a question related to agreement with the views of non-state actors have a strong role in and contribution in education. We can see the response from the government sector. There is only less than 1/3 of the respondent strongly agreed with it, although more than half of them agreed at large. In contrast, the academia, more than 2/3 agreed strongly, while less than 1/3 says average level of agreement. So it gives a reflection that how the government and non-government stakeholder think about the perception or engagement or partnership of the education. I think this is one of the key entry point for civil society to bridge this gap. Although Anthony Manus referred 5 recommendations, the regional report in Bangladesh section, it emphasized on 8 recommendations that include system development and strategy and optimizing public goods functionalities, a workable regulatory framework, improving education governance, education financing, well-designed collaboration, open and inclusive policy making, and build a social compact. So these recommendations actually provided a wide range of opportunity for the civil society to engage with. CAMPE as a national coalition, think of wider dissemination of the report is important, and helping people to take an informed decision where to move. And we need to organize series of consultation on the findings of the GEM report with diverse stakeholders and linking it with the right to education obligations. Engage with the policymakers on the findings and recommendation, and take follow-up research on critical issues. By this time, CAMPE has taken 2 research initiatives on the impact of the pandemic and how it affects the learners from the most marginalized communities. So this is one of the critical issues.
The time is over. Really, really sorry to play this role.
Yeah, in 30 seconds, I'm wrapping up. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I think we need to think about the issue of ICT and implementation of the right to education, and looking into the SDGs, looking into the partnership in the modalities of solidarity rights, looking into the governance issue in the civil and political rights, and SDG 4 in the economic, social, and cultural and environmental rights. And we'll definitely incorporate these findings and civil society concern in our upcoming advocacy issues at the national level as a national coalition. Thank you.
Thank you, Namur. Thank you very much for your presentation. And sorry to say we are running out of time. So we have now perhaps a couple of minutes for questions. Joselwa, do you see anyone wanting to ask a question?
I don't have any question in the chat box, but I think we can invite anyone to raise their hand if they would like to pose a question.
Yeah, thank you. So a quick question, maybe. So I don't see any hands, so don't worry about that. And just to inform you that we are not going to have a break. Sorry for the interpreters, because as I said, we are running out of time. So I am now going to welcome the speakers of the second part of the session. We want to welcome Mr. Delphine Dorsey, the Director of the Right to Education, who will look at the report through the lens of the Abidjan Principles. Then we will have Professor Sina Zakaria, Assistant Professor of International Education Policy at the University of Maryland, and Francis Menashi, Associate Professor in the Department of Education Studies at Brooks University. And after that, we are going to give the floor to Ryan Mahtahan, sorry for my pronunciation, the Global Head of Advisory Education and Evaluation of the Street Child. And finally, Dr. Gansen Dentur Kelly, who is a tenure track assistant research professor of international law, human rights, and sustainable development at the University of Antwerp. Thank you all for joining us today, and over to you, Mr. Delphine Dorsey.
Thank you, Luis. I'm going to share my screen as I prepare a PowerPoint. So
yeah,
I
thank you.
share my screen first. So
we see your screen.
Now, no?
Go ahead, please.
Okay. So I think it's a good transition also with what Enamul just said about mentioning the Abidjan Principle, and others have mentioned the Abidjan Principle. So I'm going to do the presentation with this angle, through this lens. So maybe just as a remember, I'm sure most of you knows about the Abidjan Principle, but I just thought I'd just do a refresh about it. If I can move here. Yes. So just to say, so I don't know if you see me as well, but I have it in my hand. And so the Abidjan Principle are human rights guiding principles. So it's a legal text that provide an authoritative interpretation of the right to education. Particularly here, I regard the right to obligation of states to provide public education and to regulate non-state actors. They impact and clarified existing obligation of states, so they don't have to ratify this text. It's applied to them. So this is in short. So there are 10 overarching principles and 97 guiding principles that must be read holistically. So just below, I will give some references, and you may find all of them in the text. I will share the link just after. So in the Abidjan Principle, we look at the obligation of states to provide quality public education, which is key. And this has been highlighted, for instance, by the person from Latin America, and how we need to secure that. The obligation of states to regulate private involvement in education. There are also guiding principles around the financing, and including the how we regulate public-private partnership to ensure like the sustainability of the right to education. There are also guiding principles on the role of donors and international actors, and also on accountability and implementation, which are key. And we've seen that in the previous presentation of the issue of enforcement and implementation of the law. They've been adopted in 2019, as Paula remember, in Abidjan, by 57 of the most qualified experts around the world, following 3 years of participatory process and drafting. I think this is very interesting, and is be a good link with the background paper I'm just going to present now. It will be drafted by human rights experts, but with input of education experts, and how we make the bridge between human rights and education have been key in the development of the Abidjan Principle, and it's what we've done in the paper I'm just going to present. As you may know, they are already widely recognized in the world with at regional level, in the Human Rights Council, UN Special Rapporteur, and recently in December 2021 in this Inter-American Principle on Freedom of Education and the Autonomy of University Autonomy. And they have been used in court, for instance, in Uganda, in policies. Here we see in Nepal and Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda, and for research. I've just seen here research done by ActionAid. So to go back in more of the topic of today and our contribution to the GEMS. So I'm going to present this briefly. It's a paper we wrote with Sylvain Aubry, so it's my colleague from the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and Frank Adamson and Meredith Galloway from the University of Sacramento in the US. And again, like what have been interesting in this paper is how we can build bridges between human rights field and education, and how education research can apply human rights framework to strengthen policy and advocacy. And this is linked to what Enamul have just said before on how we can use better human rights framework and mechanisms. So really in this paper, it was how education research can put at the center the human rights dimension of education, and especially remembering about the aim of education as defined in international law, which does not reduce only to learning and counting numeracy and literacy, but go much beyond for the full development of the human personality, and how as well we can look at both the enjoyment of the right to education and states' obligation in terms of regulation and development of policy, including budget and financing. And we have used the Abidjan Principle to develop a tool that take into account all these dimensions. And we apply this tool for 3 cases in the US, in Côte d'Ivoire, to review the education sector plan. This is a work we've done with UNESCO International Institute International Institute for Education Planning, and also to review a research that I've done before by Day Ashley on the role and impact of private school in developing country, and looking at this analysis from another angle. So what are the finding of all this research on the 3 cases? It's like reframing education analysis through human rights lens provides a sharp contrast to the narrow view of education as a human capital generator, and how we can really remind the essence of education from this human rights perspective. Also, while we've seen like there are existing case studies that seek to assess the efficacy or impact of non-state actors, but they omit aspects of education that are central through a human rights lens. And this has been mentioned before in the presentation, for instance, equity. And also, this helps as well to expand the research in a more broader way, and not just focus, for instance, as we said, on the outcome, but how we look at the legal dimension and the policy dimension, which are important to assess the full education context. So we have used the definition of the public and private done in the Abidjan Principle. So this is a guiding principle 2, which said like a public education is public if it's recognized formally by the states, if it's effectively managed and controlled by the states or a genuine representative. So this may include, for instance, a community, and it does not seek a commercial interest. And all these needs are cumulative. And this is not always a definition given for public and private. And how we define public and private is very important, because you have legal implication. When it's a public institution, states have a stronger and higher obligation. For instance, they have to provide an inclusive public education. They need to prioritize the funding on public education, while as regard private education, they must respect the freedom of parents to set up private education, and they have the obligation to regulate it. But it's different. And it's super important, because sometimes we define public education, when we look at this definition, it may be private, which can be the case, for instance, in the charter school in the US. So the human rights framework we have used is based on the, as I said, like looking both at the enjoyment of the rights by individual and collectively by the society, but also at the state's effort. So we look at the structure. So the structure is more the legal commitments, the laws they have adopted, the treaties they have ratified, and also at the policies they have developed, including financial policy and the budget allocated to education. And we look at the definition of education in human rights that go, again, like much beyond what we sometimes may see in education research. So on this tool, it's just a tool, it's not a comprehensive overview, comprehensive tool that use all the Abidjan Principle. We have selected 3 overarching principles, this OP. And for each one, we have providing the corresponding specific state obligations, that may be several. And for that, we identified some questions. This is not aimed to be comprehensive and to address all the complex issues related to non-state actor. Is propose a framework to integrate human rights framework into education research. So here on the screen, you see an example. So for instance, we have one overarching principle, which is provide a public education. A specific state obligation is, for instance, the fact like they must allocate the maximum available resources to education and prioritize free quality public education. And then you have some example of different questions that can be asked, either regarding to the legal commitment, the policy effort, or the outcome. I don't go in much detail because we don't have much time, but I'm happy to, I'm going to share the link and you can find more on it.
Thank you, Delphine.
So
Thank you very much.
I need to stop. It was my last slide. Can I just say the word on that? Or you
Just 10 seconds, please.
Now, it's just to say, like, when we look at this human rights dimension, then we need to assess different questions that have been addressed in the previous presentation. So, for instance, we cannot just look at the outcome and the on a private school if we don't look at inequalities and segregation in the whole education system. So we explain that in the paper, and I will share the link. You can find more information. You can find more information on it.
Brilliant. Thanks for sharing. Thank you very much, Delphine. Now I will welcome Professor Sina Zakari and Franz Menashi. Over to you. 10 minutes, please, for your vote. Sina.
Hi, everyone.
Okay.
I think we're all set. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the Global Campaign for Education and Education Out Loud for inviting us to comment on the GEM report through the lens of education and emergencies. So we'll be focusing on the unique issues surrounding non-state engagement in crisis contexts, and more specifically around for-profit engagement. And our comments are based largely on an advocacy brief that we recently co-authored on education and emergencies and private sector engagement for the INEE, the Interagency Network on Education and Emergencies. So we find that the 2020 GEM report clearly articulates the various and complex ways in which the non-state sector engages in education, and does not shy away from presenting any of the tensions and debates. But due to the necessary generalizability of the report, the unique challenges of non-state, and in particular for-profit engagement in education in emergency contexts, is only briefly discussed, and that's most notably in reference to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, we propose a distinctiveness to the interplay between private actors and education in emergencies, which elicits particular tensions in EIE contexts that need to be highlighted between urgent needs related to financing, innovation, and speed of response within crisis contexts on the one hand, that might be perhaps met more efficiently by the private sector, and the rights-based concerns about ensuring education equity and access and preventing exploitation of crisis-affected populations on the other. And so this presentation we're giving does not critique so much, but rather attempts to extend the GEM report's treatment of non-state engagement in order to embrace the complexity and context-specific nature of education in emergencies. So to frame the issues, we look to global conventions and international humanitarian law, rights-based development frameworks such as SDG 4, and guiding principles on education in emergency contexts, such as the INEE minimum standards. As well, the Abidjan principles, which we just heard about, clarify the human rights obligations of governments to provide public education and regulate private actors' involvement in education. However, guidance on the role of private actors in crisis situations are less clear. Our comments address this unique intersection. So briefly, we'd like to just define and explain a bit about private sector engagement in education in emergencies. So private or non-state entities, by definition, as you know, include any actor or organization that is not a government entity, including those considered both for-profit and non-profit. But given the debates associated with the specific roles and activities of actors seeking to profit from interventions in education, our comments focus on the particular area of commercial actors and their various forms of engagement. So for-profit organizations and forms of engagement include fee-based private school providers, direct business activities, for instance, education technology companies, the testing and assessment industry, and corporate social responsibility programs, which are all active in education and emergencies. Private actors and organizations in education and emergencies largely operate through partnerships. So businesses and corporate foundations rely heavily on state and non-state partners for expert knowledge and experience in the education and emergencies sector, including international as well as local NGOs as implementers of activities. As you know, public-private partnerships in school provision are common, and they're very common in crisis contexts. And global partnerships, which fund education in emergencies, such as GPE and ECW, include both public and private actors as key stakeholders. And private actors and organizations engage in education in emergencies in a variety of ways. These can be broadly categorized as financing, provision of goods and services, policymaking, knowledge generation and innovation, and advocacy. And each of these areas includes specific activities relating to emergency contexts. So I'm going to now pass it over to Zina to highlight some of the main issues around private engagement in education and emergencies that help to extend this discussion on the GEM report.
Thanks, Francine. Analyzing the various roles and issues arising from the engagement of for-profit actors in education and emergencies, we identify and unpack some key tensions. First, education in emergencies has remained chronically underfunded and inadequate to the task of reaching those considered most vulnerable in settings of crisis. Yet, although private sources might help fill funding gaps, educational advocates must be mindful of issues relating to sustainability, equity, and the government's responsibilities. Second, providing education in emergency contexts requires a response that combines both urgent action and flexibility. Yet, although for-profit actors might fill these immediate gaps, tensions can arise when the rush to become involved results in poorly coordinated, decontextualized interventions that undermine the principles of community participation and sensitivity to conflict. Third, technology presents a significant way for continuing education and learning in times of crisis. However, concerns arise from too much emphasis on technological fixes at the expense of closer alignment with humanitarian principles in education and emergencies. Tensions also arise in considering the various forms of private engagement in education and emergencies. For example, when public school systems are compromised by crises, public-private partnerships and low-cost private schools may present attractive alternative solutions. However, such options have been associated with a range of issues that show the need for strong regulation and accountability to ensure they do not contradict rights-based approaches to education. Corporate actors have also taken up increasingly visible roles in the EIE global policy arena. While their participation may advance non-traditional pathways for achieving SDG 4, it may also lead to conflicts of interest between for-profit and humanitarian aims. A growing recognition of the need to support education in emergencies has led several high-profile business actors to use their voices in awareness-raising campaigns and media activities. Although such advocacy presents a great opportunity to promote education in emergencies, it also requires long-term commitment to achieve any sustained impact. Are there ways forward? We offer some considerations for private sector engagement in education in emergencies. First, all private sector activities in education and emergencies must adhere to the do no harm principle and ensure the educational rights of affected populations. Second, prioritize the participation of affected communities to reduce the risk of decontextualized design and implementation that are misaligned with local interests and knowledge systems, leading to poor results and potentially discriminatory practices that produce, sustain, or exacerbate conflict. Third, effective private sector involvement in education in emergencies requires a sustained and ongoing commitment to public education. Fourth, private actors involved in education in emergencies must be regulated by the state and held to the same accountability principles as other non-governmental actors and state agencies in line with legally binding international human rights standards to advance quality, equity, and access. Fifth, transparency regarding conditions of funding and profit-seeking activities, such as creating new markets for products, brand association, and product testing, may help to identify conflicts of interest that counter the do no harm principle. Sixth, ensure that private funding in education and emergencies is transparent, equitable, and coordinated. Private financing, if necessary, should not undermine national and local ownership of education programs. Moreover, sustained, predictable funding is needed to make an impact on education and emergencies. And finally, given the unique tensions arising from private participation in education and emergencies, an addendum to the Abidjan Principles that directly addresses this issue would help clarify expectations for government responses. Thank you.
Thanks, Francina and Sina. Very good timing. I appreciate that. And now I will welcome Ranja Madhavan. Please go ahead, Madja.
Sure. So thank you very much, and a huge thank you to GCE and of course to GP and EOL for the opportunity to present. I am Ramya Madhavan. I'm the Global Head of Advisory at Street Child. Street Child is an education and emergencies focused organization. We're an international organization headquartered in the United Kingdom. We operate in 20 countries across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, focused on low resource environments and emergency contexts. Our involvement in the GEM report and our preparation of a background paper really comes from the perspective of an education and emergencies practitioner that is very much committed to working in partnership with states, but recognizing, as we just heard through the previous presentation from Francine and Zina, recognizing the kind of roughness of these interactions, the complexities that govern them, and the peculiarities of those complexities in conflict and crisis contexts. Our paper really looked at 5 of the contexts that we operate in. So Sierra Leone, particularly in the aftermath of the Ebola epidemic. It looked at Nigeria, Nepal in the aftermath of the 2015 earthquakes, DRC, and Afghanistan. So Nigeria, DRC, and Afghanistan is a context of protracted crisis where the constitution of the state looks very different and again is rather complicated, and explored the ways in which we think about and a framework for the ways in which we operate in partnership with the state. I won't touch on this in too much depth because Francine and Zina, I think, did a wonderful kind of exploration of the complexities of being a non-state actor in this space. But just broadly speaking, we reflect on 3 of the challenges and concerns that we recognize as non-state actors in terms of whether or not we are indeed acting in the interests of the state and its citizens, how we are incentivizing the state, recognizing that there are positive incentives and there are also negative incentives that can encourage the state to abdicate its responsibility towards its citizens, and recognizing that the state is very much the guarantor and should remain the guarantor of the right to education in the spaces that it governs. And then finally, again, as touched on, I think, in the previous presentation, concerns around the scope, scale, and sustainability of our actions, and recognizing very much that the imperative for partnership with the state for us is a desire for us to be able to take successful strategies, but see the state as the principal instrument through which those successful strategies can actually reach large numbers of children in need. The framework that we operate on when we think about our relationship with the state essentially looks at 4 different stages. In the first stage, we think of ourselves as substituting for state provision where the state isn't at that point able to provide education for children. So we reflect, for example, on instances where we have provided the first ever community schools in very remote, hard to reach areas of Sierra Leone, or we reflect on the reconstruction efforts that followed the 2015 Nepal earthquakes, where whilst the state was busy reconstructing schools in relatively easier to reach areas, we were able to then take our funding and our resourcing to harder to reach areas to ensure that children there were able to access and restore their access to education as soon as possible. We then think about how we might supplement the education system, and we talk through an example in Afghanistan where we work with community-based education centers to provide accelerated learning programs for overage children, allowing them to catch up on lost learning, which then supports their transition into the state system, recognizing in some instances that the comparative advantages that non-state actors have to provide this kind of flexible education for children, but then wanting to ensure that the child eventually moves into the state system for principally equity and equality reasons. We then talk about some examples where we've supported the state, and this is where really the spectrum moves from what we call surge support to capacity strengthening support, where we think less about the beneficiaries of our actions being the children themselves and more about the beneficiary becoming the state in terms of supporting the state to scale up successful strategies. So we provide an example, for example, in Nigeria, where we've supported the National Education Research Development Council to create a national education and emergencies curriculum in response to the recognition that there were multiple fragmented education and emergencies curricula being used across the Northeast from 2016 to 2018, and supporting the state with sponsorship and with technical support to bring together that curricula into one standardized syllabus and scope and sequence that then allowed the state to regulate the quality of education and emergencies being provided to conflict-affected children. We talk a little bit then about some of the challenges we face as non-state partners, the predominant one being how we think about staging for sustainability and recognizing that often in these partnerships, we arrive at a point where we are no longer able to support or we are no longer necessarily feeling that it is right to continue supporting, perhaps because we recognize that it is encouraging the state to abdicate its responsibility, as we touched on at the start, but at the same time recognizing that if we pull away at that point, we are leaving children potentially out of school once again. And so negotiating and navigating that relationship of what point at which we transition responsibility back over to the state and at what point in the crisis we look to stage this transition becomes particularly critical for us, as the two examples on the screen show. But we also see real openings and opportunities here. And two that we reflect on in particular is the work that we can do with communities to, in fact, relieve some of the burden on states during conflict and crisis, and the ways in which we can support resilience building from the ground up that in turn encourages and allows the state to focus its efforts on the hardest hit or the most affected or the most marginalized groups, which again is a complementary role that we feel we can play both in terms of preparedness as well as in terms of response, recovery, and resilience in and around a crisis or conflict. And finally, we reflect a little bit and think that it is quite critical to consider here that the non-state actors, as various presentations today have touched on, are such a diverse, heterogeneous group, but the role of local level actors in particular, and of CSOs in particular, becomes especially critical for us as international actors to think about investing in the capacities of, investing in supporting partnership building with the state of, in order to sustainably continue doing that work of supporting state provision. As a whole, we very much welcome the focus of the GEM report and its proposition that we really think about a system of partnerships and the troubling of sort of idealized notions of statehood, and recognizing that it is really the entire system that has the responsibility for providing education for children. And thank you very much once again. I'll close here for the opportunity to speak and very much look forward to continuing to take these conversations forward with this community. Thanks. Back over to you, Eduardo.
Brilliant timing. Thank you, Ramya. Thank you very much. So finally, we will hear Dr. Ganse Erdentur-Kelly. Over to you, Gans. I can hear you. We can hear you, Gans. Kuselwa, can you hear Gans, or is only me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank goodness.
Go ahead, please.
And can you see my slides changing, I wonder?
Yes, I see.
Okay, perfect. So thank you so much to Global Campaign for Education and to Education Out Loud for the invitation and you know, for being involved in this very enriching seminar. And I'd like to speak a little bit about human rights accountability when non-state actors are involved in education. And I think there has been a lot said already. So these are just background, and I think Ms. Dorsey already paid a lot of sort of attention to these. So and I'm a legal researcher, so I tend to gravitate towards going back to where the obligations are found. And the main legal bases of the right to education, they're found in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, but also the Convention on the Rights of the Child as a general point. But I think our previous speakers also pointed to humanitarian law in conflict contexts that can be also very important. And more recently, it has been operationalized through Sustainable Development Goal 4. So it's both a part of a legally binding commitment undertaken by the state, but also these what we call in law soft law commitments like sustainable development and the SDGs. And the main legal content is that the state has these three levels of these obligations along three levels of education. So primary education to be compulsory, available free of charge to all, secondary education to hopefully be made available and accessible, and hopefully at one point free of charge as well, and higher education made available on the basis of capacity. So we had that question of, is it possible to completely outsource? And the obligation is that the state should actually do all that is in its power to be able to make it available as a public provision as well. But of course, the right to education is one of those rights that is part of the so-called economic, social, and cultural rights, and it does require a lot of public resources to be put into it if the state is going to be able to realize this. And in the law, we call this a right that is subject to progressive realization, which means that the state has an obligation to realize this right to the maximum available extent of its resources, but that it has some immediate obligations. And of course, I didn't write here, but there's of course that obligation to cooperate internationally. So it's not just the state where the education is taking place, it's also all the other states. And here, especially donor states, the wealthier states have a really important role to play. And those minimum core obligations, non-discrimination, the content of education being not just for learning, but really for that holistic development of those involved in education, compulsory and free primary education, which means that there might be a choice to opt for private education, but that should not be the only option available. So the quality education should be offered to all without fees. And all education that is provided through different means, so different private actors or public actors, should really fit into one overall national education strategy for the entire spectrum of education that is provided. And here, the question for me is really one of duty bearing. So if you look at the individuals and the communities as rights holders, the state, we talk a lot about the state having those obligations to respect, to protect, to fulfill the right to education. And that means it doesn't do harm, so it respects the do no harm, doesn't take retrogressive measures that take away from what is provided already, but then it also has to regulate and monitor other actors. So as soon as non-state actors are involved, that the state has that obligation to monitor and regulate those actors. And of course, there's the obligation to fulfill. And our question here from a legal perspective is, if non-state actors are involved in the provision, so if they're participating in the provision of such essential public services, should they be subject to the same obligations? And it is a question of, I think, sort of comprehensiveness, in that public engagement in education does not cease when non-state actors are involved. So we will see that the public system will be involved either through legislative frameworks, international legal obligations. We often now more and more see these partnership settings. And there's ideally always going to be that monitoring and oversight of everything that is done by private actors at the local levels. And the legal content of the rights, it doesn't change and should remain unchanged, irrespective of who provides that education. So be it public, private, or hybrid. And this was also, I think, a really important point that the GEM report touched upon, that the content of the right, what is the entitlement of the rights holder does not change. And so I look at the accountability issue. One is that, and this comes from a framework that was provided by the OHCHR and CSR, so a report called Who Will Be Accountable? And so they look at three facets of accountability. One is responsibility, which is the existence of clear norms and standards of behavior. Answerability, whether you're answerable as a provider, as a designer of education in this context, and enforceability. So what happens in terms of compliance and monitoring, and what happens if you fail to live up to the norms. And so I've been looking at multi-stakeholder-based partnering in education, and it's not yet published, but these are the preliminary results of my research. So we find that in these multi-stakeholder-based partnering scenarios, and this is in education, but also in other areas of public services, that there's diffused responsibility. Often there are parallel or private normative systems created by funders, especially by donors and by providers that coexist alongside state systems. The provision is not always in line with the right to education. And the duty bearing under the law does not sometimes reflect power relationships, which is to say sometimes the state is unable to discharge its obligations, but then the private actors going into it, they might have actually more power in the local context, but not that accountability level. There's limited answerability. So a lot of these providers, especially if they're in project-based settings, tend to be answerable to funders and donors, but not always to rights holders. Often the compliance, so there's weak enforceability, the compliance mechanisms are often privatized, there's often lack of public oversight and monitoring, especially when the capacity of the state is weak, and there's often no recourse for rights holders when the normative standards are not upheld. And so this is going to be my last slide, so I'll conclude on time. But we are seeing some trends in education and other public goods, but I think in education, it really should be kept in mind that because we're now seeing increasingly education more and more as a sustainable development objective, and sometimes moving away from that rights-based angle, we tend to think of all the financing issues involved. So there's a financing gap. Well, the state can't do it, so we need to catalyze private financing. And that what we've started doing globally is to use donor funding that is supposed to go into development, official development assistance, to catalyze or leverage private investments. And there are often these so-called results-based instruments such as education bonds that are piloted and rolled out on a project basis. And there's a drive for more partnerships, but it's not evident how these initiatives and putting public money into this kind of privatized framework is going to be able to support national public systems so that we have progressively a realization where the state can be able to provide primary, secondary, and tertiary education to all that want to join and without discrimination. And often these interventions tend to be piecemeal, one-off, and non-inclusive. So I think we need to really keep in mind these trends and see how they bode with accountability under the right to education. Thank you.
Brilliant, Gans. Thank you very much. for your presentation, and thank you to all the speakers for your presentation. So we are now to have 5 minutes for questions. So please feel free to raise your hand, and my colleague Selva will give you a space to open the microphone. Do you see any hand, Kuselwa? Or any question in the chat box?
Louise, we don't have questions in the chat box, and we have enabled all the speakers to be able to talk. So please raise your hand for any comments, for any questions, and you'll be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Kuselwa. Okay, it seems that we have no questions, so that is absolutely fine. And because we are running a little bit late, so I will give the floor to our global coordinator, Grant Casanjete, who will be closing the session. Over to you, Grant.
Okay, thank you so much, Louise, and thanks to all our speakers, our partners, and our members for joining in. I think, we have all learned quite a lot. Thank you so much for the insights. I hope that we use this in our advocacy. Just to note that, the recording of this will be posted on our Learning Hub together with, the presentation, so that, you can continue to engage with this. Let me just end this meeting with a quote following the speech from Rifat to say, education is a basic right that can simply not be sold in a market. We then must contest the rhetoric and actions of those actors who want, and indeed who are making profits from education. If we do not do so, we will see more and more private companies and corporations selling education services and just forgetting, or better to say, ignoring, that education is a human right. We must demand from governments and states an effective protection of everyone's right to education. So thank you so much for joining the event. We have now come to the end of the meeting. Thank you, and good day, good night, and good morning.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much. And thank you to all my colleagues from the Global Campaign for Education and Education Out Loud for organizing this. Bye-bye, and see you next time.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.